So what is my most expensive and least expensive locomotive that I run on my railroad? Well, I'm going to answer that, plus a bunch more of your questions today on Coffee and Trains. Hey everybody, my name's Jimmy. Welcome to Coffee and Trains. Today I am drinking some locally roasted coffee that I got from a place right around where I live. It's really, really good. If you want to tell me what kind of coffee you are drinking and have it featured just like these guys here below, you can do that by just leaving it in the comments below. Also, this is a monthly Q&A. If you'd like to have your own question answered, you can put that in the comments below and you may see it on next month's Q&A. Cheers. SFC Rambo 60 asks, Bullfrog Snot, is it any good and how do you apply it in N-scale? Well, I've actually got a little can of it right here, and if I ever need to add a little bit more traction to a locomotive, that is how I do it. For those of you who don't know, Bullfrog Snot is a liquid traction tire that you can apply to your wheels, and basically what I typically do is I will only apply it to either one wheel or one axle at most because it will block some of the electrical conductivity. But basically what I'll do is I'll flip the locomotive over and I will basically connect it to some DC power and let it constantly run, and then use a small brush to apply it to the flat part, not the flange, but the actual flat part of the wheel itself, and just let that coast over. And again, I only do one wheel or one axle max. I don't do a bunch of them, and typically I'll do the rearmost axle when I'm putting it on a wheel or an axle. So that's Bullfrog Snot. It's a really cool little product, and a little jar like this will last you a long time. Brendan Cully 2607 asks if I have any tips for cleaning small tracks. So what I would typically say is the easiest way to keep your track clean is just to run your trains a lot, because that's going to get them relatively dust-free and everything, but you will have some oxidation issues from the little tiny little shorts and little sparks that come that you can't really see. So what I will typically do, the simplest thing I do is I simply just wipe down my track. You can use just a rag, or I typically use some sort of like shop towel to do that. You can also just use something like a Bright Boy from Walthers. But these are just simple things that you can do for cleaning track. I will typically stay away from most chemicals and things like that. Like if it's really, really bad, like if there's paint on it, I will put some IPA on a paper towel or a shop towel and clean it that way, but I try to stay away from that. There's also, of course, the no-ox method, which is, I've never tried that before, but I know a ton of people do that after the video from Ron's Trains and things. But those are typically the things that I do for cleaning my track. Rick Evansek 830 says that he is a military modeler and he's getting into N-scale and he's looking for information on detailing full-size vehicles. He says that it's a lot easier to find with military vehicles than it is locomotives. Well, the one thing that I would say is definitely just go to Google and look at what the pieces are that you see on different locomotives and rolling stock. It's pretty easy to Google certain things and figure out different schematics and everything, and that can really give you measurements and things that are on there. It's really, there's not a ton of like definitive sources, but there's a lot of like hodgepodge where you can find it on forums, you can find it on different things. A lot of times if you just Google what you're looking for, like say you're looking for a specific horn for a diesel, you can just Google, let's say, F7 New York Central horn, and it'll come up some sort of forum topic or typically like that, or you can find the sound. Wikipedia is also another great place because a lot of times they'll have a lot of pictures that you can look at for detailing. And again, Google Images is the thing that I do the most of, but you can also find, especially if you're looking at more modern stuff, in your post you say 1940s era, you can find the companies that make the products and they will have blueprints. But yeah, just Google is your friend on this, and you can also find a bunch of model railroad forums, and there's a bunch of people who have made websites dedicated to certain rolling stock that you can find. Check out a bunch of rail fanning websites and videos. Those are things that you can find these items on as well. Chris Painter 7894, he asked a question about installing surface mounted point motors or turnout motors for us here in the States when they're laid on cork road bed on top of foam. So what he's basically asking is that the foam is an inch thick and the screw that it comes with doesn't go all the way down to the wooden baseboard to hold it. Well, there's a couple things you can do. Number one is see if you can go to a local hardware store or something like that and just take your screw and try to match it in terms of size. You don't need to necessarily match it in terms of the thread count, but I know here in the States you can go to places like Lowe's and Home Depot, and they've actually got just like places where you can pull out the screws and you can find specialty screws and small screws. Don't know how small that is. You can also try looking on Amazon for that size as well. Another thing to consider would be if this is going to be permanently affixed and you are confident enough, you can also use some glue. Something here in the States would be like liquid nails, but a good project glue, not like white glue, would be something that could hold it in place. But I would be more confident on that. But the screws, just go and look for at a hardware store, see if you can find a longer version of that screw or a screw that will fit, so that you can get that done. Mike Madugno 5879, he asks a question about lubricants and what kind of lubricants. Now there are model specific lubricants that will work with plastics as well as the metal parts as well of a model railroad locomotive. And that's important because most of the time the gears that we are looking at for in the trucks and things like that are made of plastic. So usually the go-to is something like Labelle 108, something like that that's specifically mentioned for the major scales. Labelle has a lot of different lines of model oils, so that is definitely what I would check out. You can find them on Amazon, or you can try to find them at your local model railroad shop. Mark's Gone Wicked asked if I would consider using a servo instead of a stepper motor for a turntable, and he's not talking about the little tiny ones, the little blue ones that we use. I would, but the thing is that a stepper motor is going to get you a lot more of the prototypical speed, and they're really not that terrible to control. A servo is going to maybe have a little bit more jerkiness, but it really depends on the motor you are using. For the size and everything, a stepper motor I think is going to do better for a turntable, but it all depends on what you can make the motor do. It's, after all, it's your project, but I would continue using stepper motors for turntables. S3TW0L4 asks, how can you tell if a motor is fried? He says he has a locomotive that refuses to run. Well, the easiest way is to get a low power supply thing, something like a 9-volt battery or maybe a 5-volt power supply that has some just stripped ends, or you have wires attached to the end of a battery, and get to the motor itself and see if you can make it run. If the motor runs just fine with those direct connections, then it's something else in there. Most likely it's not impossible to fry a motor, but it can be fried. But what I would do is probably look at your gears. If it's DCC, look at your decoder, things like that. But the easiest way to test a motor is to get it out of the locomotive and connect it directly to some low power and just see if it runs. If it runs, then you know that the motor is just fine and it's something else. And you say that you may have something shorted out on the track as well. You can tell that by just looking at the way your connections for pulling track power are. Brian Page Model Trains asked if I can elaborate how I did the barrel plug for DC to DCC switchover. And I can show you that right now. So basically I have a little barrel plug that connects to my main hub for all of my wiring for DCC. Now, if you're wired for DCC, you're going to be wired for DC just fine. And if you're wired for DC, you're going to be wired for DCC just fine. You may just have to do some extra connections and being a little mindful of where you're routing power. But with this, all I have is I have a female barrel plug that's connected to my main lead that goes to my main power distribution hub. And then what I do is I have the connection to my DCC system has a male one, and then I also have a wire that goes from a DC power controller to a male one, so that I can just unplug the DCC one and I can plug in the DC one. DC and DCC, that's really hard to say, but that's what I typically do. The Old Grumpy Hunter asks if I have a track plan for the layout behind you. I think enough people have asked me for this, and I have a video a while back that I showed it, but those can be hard to find because I've got like 500 videos. I think I'm going to put it up on my website on its own page so that you guys can see that and you can see the track that I'm using and everything like that. I think that's going to be the best way, and that way you guys can just access it, and if you want to build it, great, because it is a good, decent-sized layout. It's 80 inches by 110 inches, which is not a huge layout and can fit in a lot of spaces. So I would love to share this layout plan with you guys. I just got to get the time to put it up on the website. David Kohler 136 asks, why not add battery power or radio control, or what some call dead rail? Well, in larger scales, that's definitely an option. In scale, I've thought about trying it, but it's a lot to cram in a really small space, and you're talking about custom circuit boards, and when you look at the batteries, you're talking about getting the batteries so small that they're not going to run very long either. So I think that the system that they have in place right now is the best for continuous running, and it's actually a pretty fleshed out system, DCC and of course DC a while back. So battery power is great, but it would require a lot of internal work on the locomotives, or having dedicated battery and control cars that had to run with it. So there's a lot of issues with doing in scale with battery. Definitely as you get to the larger scales, you can do that. Garden railroading has battery power all over the place. There's plenty of tutorials on how to do that, and a lot of people have done that. I've seen people do that with an 18-volt drill battery, which is something I've considered. But that is the main reason why. It's just a space issue, and it would be the function issue of it. You're not going to get as realistic of running with battery power right now in scale. The Train Lover DK asks, what's your most expensive and least expensive locomotives? Well, this is probably not going to come as a shock. My most expensive locomotive is my Broadway Limited Big Boy. That thing is not the cheapest thing in the world. It's not the most expensive big boy I've ever seen, but it is definitely not the cheapest. But it's got a ton of features, it runs really well, and it has smoke in scale, which is just really, really cool. And my least expensive locomotive in terms of what I paid for it is probably my little railway diesel car, my RDC, that I've run in an operation before. I paid $35 for that at a train show. It's an old Concours, and I mean really old Concours, and it won't run on code 55 track because the wheel flanges are too big. But it is a great little car. I was able to convert it to DCC really easily. I actually put a new motor in it as well. And that thing is just great. It's not the smoothest runner because it's old and it doesn't have flywheels, anything like that. But it is a nice little train to run. The RDC, it works great, especially since I think I've put a grand total of $60 into it, including purchasing it. So yeah, those are my most expensive and my least expensive locomotives. Now, when you get up to my ones that I buy new, you're really looking at Kato and the Scale Trains Operator Series. Those are right around $100, maybe a little less depending on when you buy it. And those are both great running locomotives. I think everybody knows how well Kato's run, but I buy everything DCC ready and put my own decoders into it for the most part. So those are my most and least expensive locomotives. If you would like your question answered on next month's Q&A, you can leave that in the comments below. I really love answering you guys' questions. You guys have a lot of good questions, and some of them actually kind of test me a little bit on my knowledge, so it keeps me on my toes as well. So thank you all so much for watching. Until next time, I'm Jimmy from the DIY and Digital. Stay safe, be kind, drink some coffee, and happy railroading.